Okay, we're live. Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome to our conversation between Anuk Arudpragasam and Deepak Unnikrishnan. We're really excited to have both of them here. And as you know, Anuk's new book, A Passage North, has been shortlisted for the Booker. But we're also happy to say that we've included it in our travel subscription way before that happened. And his book, A Story of a Brief Marriage, is one of our favorite books at our store. And Deepak has also been in store with us late 2019, I think, when we could do in-person events. So really happy to have him here again. These are the two books that we're talking about, and they're both available in store. So please pick up a copy. Um, for those of you who are here who know us, you know everything you need to know. But for those who are new, we're an independent women-run bookstore. We have a children's library and cafe that are on hold at the moment. Our work is to bring diverse stories and perspectives to our readers and through our books and events also. We have an online store, something we want to emphasize. We ship across India and we try to bring some of our collections and curation to our online store as well. So we hope that helps you browse as if you were with us. Uh, we've been running a book subscription program for this is our second year now. And this year, our subscription is themed around travel. So for the book, September, we had Anuk's book, A Passage North. So we're happy that about 200 readers have read it. We hope you're all here to listen to Anuk. And we've just announced our new subscription for the month of October, which includes The Lost Pianos of Siberia by Sophie Roberts, which is also very exciting. So just a small set of introductions to the two wonderful authors we have here who will be in conversation. Anuk was born in Colombo, Sri Lanka. His first novel, The Story of a Brief Marriage, is about the experience of one day in the Sri Lankan War. A Passage North came out in July, and as I said earlier, shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Congratulations, Anuk. Deepak Unnikrishnan is the author of Temporary People, which is also an award-winning book about Gulf narratives steeped in Malayali and South Asian lingo. We're very, very excited to have them both here, and they're going to speak to each other, and Anuk will start with a reading. So without further ado, I'm removing myself. So thank you both.
Thank you, Kavya and Champaca, for having us. And thank you, Deepak, for agreeing to do this conversation. So I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the beginning of the book, so you won't need any context. The present, we assume, is eternally before us, one of the few things in life from which we cannot be parted. It overwhelms us in the painful first moments of entry into the world, when it is still too new to be managed or negotiated, remains by our side during childhood and adolescence, in those years before the weight of memory and expectation. And so it is sad and little unsettling to see that we become, as we grow older, much less capable of touching, grazing, or even glimpsing it. The closest we seem to get to the present are those brief moments we stop to consider the spaces our bodies are occupying, the intimate warmth of the sheets in which we wake, the scratched surface of the window on a train taking us somewhere else, as if the only way we can hold time still is by trying physically to prevent the objects around us from moving. The present, we realize, eludes us more and more as the years go by, showing itself for fleeting moments before losing us in the world's incessant movement, fleeing the second we look away and leaving scarcely a trace of its passing. Or this, at least, is how it usually seems in retrospect, when in the next brief moment of consciousness, the next occasion we are able to hold things still, we realize how much time has passed since we were last aware of ourselves, when we realize how many days, weeks, and months have slipped by without our consent. Events take place, moods ebb and flow, people and situations come and go. But looking back during these rare junctions in which we are, for whatever reason, lifted up from the circular daydream of everyday life, we are slightly surprised to find ourselves in the places we are, as though we were absent while everything was happening, as though we were somewhere else during the time that is usually referred to as our life. Waking up each morning, we follow by circuitous routes the thread of habit, out of our homes, into the world, and back to our beds at night, move unseeingly through familiar paths, one day giving way to another, and 1 week to the next, so that when in the midst of this daydream something happens and the thread is finally cut, When, in a moment of strong desire or unexpected loss, the rhythms of life are interrupted, we look around and are quietly surprised to see that the world is vaster than we thought, as if we'd been tricked or cheated out of all that time, time that in retrospect appears to have contained nothing of substance, no change and no duration, time that has come and gone but left us somehow untouched.
I was hoping you'd keep going, Anuk. Welcome. And for those joining us, good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. I hope you're well, given the circumstances of the world. So Anuk, this is our first proper conversation, which is strange because you're one of the first writers I met when I started out. So let me ask a simple question, and then we'll delve into both books eventually. May I ask why you write?
That's a really good question. It's actually a question nobody's asked me in such a context. It's difficult to say because I think the reason that I write has changed over time. I think I began writing when I was maybe 20, 21, so 12 years ago. And I suppose when I started, I mean, when you're that age, when you're 20 and you're 21, there's a lot that you don't understand. I mean, there's still obviously a lot that one doesn't understand, but there's a lot that you don't understand, and there's a kind of like longing to understand, a longing to, I guess, to perceive and to understand the world that we find ourselves in. And I think, and also this hope that I guess in writing about the world, in writing about one's moods and one's feelings, one can come to some kind of stance. One can know, I guess, how to hold oneself in response to the world. What kind of voice to use, what kind of posture, what kind of expressions. There's a certain kind of searching, and I think that feeling of searching for me when I was younger had obviously a lot to do with the fact that when one is young, one's life is not yet determined. If you belong to the middle or the upper middle class like myself, then you presumably have a number of choices that you can make about the kind of life that you live. And I thought maybe that there was something I could understand about how to make those choices through writing, by understanding myself, by understanding my relation to others. And then obviously, as you grow older, life starts to set. Certain habits become hardened, certain attitudes, certain stances, certain tastes develop. You make choices that then determine the course of life later on. You figure out what you want to do. You figure out where you want to live. You figure out who your friends are and who you want to be surrounded by. And so I think I had this experience, and I think it's common to a lot of people, that as you grow older, the future seems to diminish a little bit in terms of its possibility. It's much easier to predict when you're 30 or 40 how life will be 5 or 10 years in the future than it is when you're 15 or 20. And so I think this sense of writing as something that can tell me how to live or tell me how to be has become less important in a way, as one has to accept, make choices and then accept the consequences of those choices. So I think over time, writing has become less about discovery or less about searching, and more about a certain kind of acceptance, or rather, let's say, within the structure that has come to frame one's life, about maybe finding spaces within those structures in which certain kinds of consolation are possible, certain kinds of reassurance, certain small joys, or small fulfillments. And so, I mean, something I was thinking about when I started writing this second novel, I was about 27 or 28 when I started. So I don't know. I guess in order for writing to be for it to be continue to be have some kind of living and real role in one's life, its role has to change also as one's life changes.
And does distance help? Because both books are set in Sri Lanka. But then I'm wondering whether distance offers a certain clarity when you respond to questions, whatever those questions are, or whether distance offers a certain kind of amnesia that's useful. And I'm thinking of writers like Alexander Hemon, who was stuck in the US when the war in Yugoslavia broke out. And then he started figuring out the English language because what he was speaking wasn't English. And he had to learn how to think and write in English. So I suppose this is a two-part question connected to distance and even language, because the books are in English, but it also has a beating Tamil heart, even if I don't know if that's fair to say, but I'm curious.
I grew up bilingual, but Tamil was really at most, but I was educated in English. I think I studied in Tamil for maybe just 1 or 2 years when I was very young. So English has always been the language of, if one wants to discuss politics, or if one wants to discuss the economy, or if one wants to discuss anything that is supposedly sophisticated, it's the language one turns to, whereas Tamil would be the language of like a more domestic language, a language to use in the kitchen, or when you're fighting with your family, or this kind of thing. So yeah, there's this I mean, it's nice of you to say that that Tamil has some resonance in this book. I don't know that I don't know that I would say that, because I mean, English is, as you say, such a I mean, sorry, you didn't say this, but English is such a it's such a distinct language, and it's such a it's so far removed its sources from the place that I grew up, and I think in general, if you grow up in South Asia, it's in English, warmth. The word warmth is a good quality. In Tamil, the word coolness is a good quality. Like all of these things that have to do with climate and region shape the language. And I guess, like if you grow up feeling at home in English, at least in Sri Lanka, but I'm assuming also in South Asia. Because this language has a relatively long history in these parts of the world also, you forget that the language doesn't belong to you. And I think when I went to and you also refer to the fact that I lived in the US for maybe 10 or 11 years of my life, and I think one of my kind of this experience that I had when I went to the US was also that the English language is not mine, that specific grammar that we have, which is closely related, obviously, which is English grammar in South Asia, adjusts itself to the language of to the regional language in various ways, and the language is so it's different from how it's spoken in different parts of the US or the UK. The dictionaries are from those parts of the world. Universities, publishers, the people who determine in a way the future of the language, or at least the future of the legitimate use of the language elsewhere. So I just realized that it's not. It's not my language. It's not my language in a sense, but it's slightly different from also. Talking about distance, because I grew up in Colombo, in the south of Sri Lanka, but my first novel was entirely set in the northeast of Sri Lanka, and a significant part of my second novel is also set in the northeast of Sri Lanka. And for most of my life, those parts of the country were cut off. I never visited my ancestral village until I was 20 years old. That was the first time. And when I went, it had been 25 years since my mother had been to the home that she grew up in. So in terms of distance, I wouldn't actually say that in America I was further away from the Northeast than I was when I was in Colombo. In a sense, I was closer actually, because in Colombo there's a false sense of proximity to the Northeast, a place that is actually, it's almost, it was physically cut off, but it's experienced almost as a metaphysical division between these two parts of the country, and when you live in a place, there's a certain kind of normalcy. I think one is always immersed in the everyday, in waking up, going to bed, in work. So the Northeast, in a sense, the war, everything, all of this was normalized, and the things that happened at the end of the war also were in some way normalized. They were brought up, dismissed, or denied, and you continue with everyday life. Whereas if you live abroad, as in fact 50% of the population of Sri Lankan Tamils now live outside the country because of the war, in a way you have a clearer view of certain things. You're less distracted by the everyday, and in a sense I think my view of the Northeast was it was clearer in the sense that there was nothing to distract me from the scenes of violence that were coming out of that part of the country. Whereas in Colombo, there would have been a lot of things that would have one would have been gaslit in many ways. So so in that sense, I don't think actually I was any more distant over the course of 10 years in the US than I would have been over the course of 20 years growing up in Colombo. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it does, Anuk. I mean, forgive me, I didn't mean to categorize. That wasn't the intention at all. It was more about wondering about how you think of distance and look at distance as a writer. So maybe this might be an interesting follow-up, or probably a terrible one. I'm curious about whether we can talk about time.
Yeah.
Because I'm going to read from my notes, because when I read you, it genuinely feels like I'm in the arms of someone with the ability to suspend and sort of lengthen time in situations where, in my head anyway, time shouldn't slow down, when people are being bombed or how they die after they've survived war. Like I'm thinking this particular example from The Story of a Brief Marriage, where you have Dinesh, whose mother has died, and they're running. And then he flees, and he's holding these plastic bags. And then he returns to the body of his mother to ensure that her bag is left by her side. And then he covers her up. Dignity is something that's genuinely important in that book. And when I'm reading A Passage North, dignity comes up again as to how people die, how they ought to die, etc. So I'm curious about craft with respect to time. How do you think about it? Do you think the attempts in both books are different? I'm curious about how you may have evolved as a writer, in your opinion, or I'm just curious, period, in how you respond to the question.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's related also, I guess, to distance in some way. In The Story of a Brief Marriage, it's set. I mean, both these novels are set over a short period of time. The Story of a Brief Marriage is set over a few hours, less than a day, really, and we have maybe there's about 190 pages, 200 pages devoted to that amount of time. And in this book, this new book, A Passage North, we have about 300 pages devoted to about a period of about 3 days, 2 or 3 days. So in a kind of, it takes a lot longer to read each book than it does for the events being described in the book to take place. And in that very kind of obvious and technical sense, the time is drawn out. With my first book, I think time is really, it's kind of, in a way, I feel like it's my central philosophical interest in writing, to understand time or to capture time, its different flows, the ways in which we can live in parallel times or in different times parallelly. I wanted to. There's this I think phenomenon that we've all experienced where a certain event that we experience might last a brief period of time, but it echoes out into the rest of your life, and these events, something can happen or something can be witnessed or seen or done in these moments that really have a significance that is belied by the clock time that elapses while these events are occurring. And in a way, this is a thought that is not from me. It's actually it's something the Spanish novelist Javier Marias talks about how in ordinary life the time that certain events deserve is not given to them, because the world is always ongoing, because things are always happening, because as soon as one thing is over, you have to face the next, and on and on and on. And that certain moments actually deserve more time than the world can give them. And that literature, it's one of the things that literature specifically can do, that to give those moments the time that they actually deserve. To give them a time that is more consonant with their significance, with the duration they have in our soul, as opposed to the duration they have on a clock. And I wanted to give, in my first novel, I wanted to give certain events in the life of the main character that kind of time. And also because time is something that in 2008 and 2009, during this period of intense killing, people did not have. So it was something that I felt also a kind of moral imperative to give this character time. But also, I guess, as a writer, and I suppose by extension as a reader of my own work, and for other readers of it, there is a certain because of the kinds of things I'm depicting, a period of vast and incredible brutality and violence, in which it seems to all the people who are trapped in this shrinking zone that the world, not just their lives, but the world as a whole, is collapsing. There's a tendency as a spectator, which I was, as a privileged spectator, there's a tendency to look away at such times, to look away from violence. One has, I think, when one sees another person in difficulty or in suffering, the impulse is to act, to do something, whether that is some kind of immediate individual act of help or healing or therapy, or if it's or if we understand that in a broader sense, in terms of some kind of political response, there's always a desire to do something. And I feel, or I felt with that first novel, that the desire to act was also a desire to distract oneself from what is happening. When you act on a situation, you don't have to look at the situation, you don't have to dwell on the situation. We want to spend as little time as possible with such situations because they're difficult to bear. And I wanted to force myself to stay with the situation. And so I drew out the time also. There was so I guess there were with my first book, there were many reasons that I wanted to give. I wanted to expand the time of what was happening. There's also, with my second novel also, there was this, I guess, there was this interest, broadly speaking, in expanding time in the novel, but it was was a little different, as you say. I think I was also more interested in thinking about time explicitly in this novel, which is, I mean that came out, I think, in the passage from the opening that I read, and I think that has to do with also the way that like certain events or certain periods of time don't let us go. We return to them constantly. We are kind of living in that time constantly. And for me, the genocide at the end of the war was very much that. It is something that, even though I never participated, even though my body was never hurt, and my future, in many senses, was not affected by what happened, it's a time in my community's history that I have not been able to leave. And so I think that's the case for many, and in fact probably all of us. And so I was interested in this question of the passage of time, actually, and the way in which time can pass but also can seem not to pass, in which many things can change, but also in which, in some senses, nothing has changed. And this was something I kind of was exploring more generally in this book, the way in which different kinds of experience, not just the experience of violence of this kind, but in love or in trauma, certain things never leave us.
So that might be a good segue into the next question I have for you. But before I ask that, I'll give you a little bit of breather and say that in The Story of a Brief Marriage, you have those paragraphs about the gecko with the paralyzed leg and the crow hit by shrapnel about to die. So even though you say, as I'm hearing you talk about time, it's not necessarily time that's directly proportional to people. It's also about time directly proportional to living things. So it sort of forced me to think and rethink and wonder. You made me pause, and I wanted to share that. But related is my next question, and this is turning to the new book, A Passage North. For me, it would be convenient, as someone who's asking questions, or perhaps even useful, to talk about war. But with your permission, could we talk about how the new book approaches hope, if that's at all possible? So to give viewers a little bit of context, I'm not giving anything away when I say Rani, the caretaker, has died. She's fallen into a well and she's broken her neck. The most surreal kind of death, given that this woman has survived the war but has lost her sons. And this message has been transmitted to Krishan, and he's received it. And the book, to a degree, is that journey. So I'm curious, because in the first one you have, this is the story of a brief marriage, two people, Dinesh and Ganga, but particularly Dinesh, who dreams. But then in your head, in my head as a reader, I'm thinking, these dreams will not come true, but he's still dreaming. Whereas here, and I could be wrong about this, in A Passage North, I'm curious as to how, as a writer, you've not necessarily dissected hope, how you've thought about hope. And I'm not looking for any specific resolution, but I'm curious whether there is a response to the question.
Yeah, it's not actually, it's a good question, because I haven't really, I have thought about hope, I guess, in relationship to my first novel, which is, as you say, it's set in such a dark and hopeless place, and yet the scenes that are, the moments that are dwelled on, are moments that are hopeful, in which Dinesh comes to terms with his body, or with his language, comes to terms with what it means to have to be next to another person, the possibility of intimacy. All of these things are kind of dwelled upon in this context, in this situation of inevitable death, but also this kind of certain things are disclosed about, I guess, the possibility of being in touch with oneself and being in touch with another, that are fundamentally hopeful. And I think I mean, this has to do also with this observation you made earlier about dignity, which is I think very important to me as a writer in dealing with these questions, and not just me. I think it's a very central concept in Sri Lankan Tamil culture, and this is a concept that has been used to articulate a lot of, I guess, political aspiration for the Tamils of Sri Lanka, dignity. But with the second novel, it wasn't. The second novel, in a way, is, I think, it's full of longing in a way, and I don't know how longing is different from hopefulness. The longing for something that maybe we cannot articulate, but that we know we need, and that we're in search of in some way or the other, and there, I mean, this book is a kind of study in different longings. The longing of Rani, whose children have died. The longing of Anjum for a kind of a politically more fulfilling world, and the longing of Krishan and his grandmother, and there's a slightly pessimistic, I guess. There is a certain kind of pessimism about longing, and in fact desire in general. This idea that we can find what we want, or that we can get what we want. There's this line, but actually I don't know if I included it in the book, but it's one of the lines in the book, in my head at least, that there's the dissatisfaction of not getting what you want, and then there's the dissatisfaction of getting what you want and realizing that it isn't what you want, or that what you wanted cannot really give you what you want. And I think this kind of, I mean, it has to do with, I think, also now writing 10 years after the end of the war, 10 years after this scene of indescribable violence, of spending time in the Northeast and spending more and more time, also time witnessing the passing of time in this part of the country, and seeing how difficult it is to move on from such an event, to see how simply how people's lives, even if they're physically well, have been destroyed and will always remain marked by this. I think when the war just ended, there was, maybe I, in some sense, had this hope that also the character Krishan shares, that maybe there is a possibility of future flourishing from the ruins of this society, that maybe something can be built, something new, and as time passes and as things remain the same, as we move back into an ordinary life that is marked and scarred by these things, but that in which responding to these things is impossible, both on a personal level and at a political level. There's a certain kind of some people never get better after witnessing such things. Some people are marked for the rest of their lives, and I think that became clearer and clearer to me as years went by, and as you see certain people who just are not able to move on.
And you have those examples too. The pessimism is present. And it's not just that, there's also intergenerational scarring that I'm not sure you can necessarily get over. So it's also fascinating to me to hear a writer talk about their work, especially after I've read them fairly recently, the new book. And I'm thinking in my head, hope. But then to hear you use the word longing, which is more apt and more adequate, I'd say I stand corrected. May I ask you another question connected to rituals? Because it seems to me that you linger on them somewhat, especially funerals. And I'm not saying that to sort of paint you as extremely grim and dreary, but I'm curious because you use the example of the funeral in both books to sort of not necessarily break things down, but to show us things that, as a reader, I'm grateful for. But I'm curious, and this is not me over-intellectualizing these moments. This is not comparative lit me going, aha, this is what this means. But I'm curious. Ritual. I think the word ritual is what I'm really after.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think it's very important. And there's this, I mean, the two rituals, I mean, there's obviously individual ritual, there's personal ritual, rituals of bathing, of defecating that are like dealt with in my first book, but also in the more conventional sense of ritual, there's a marriage in my first book, and in the second book there's a funeral that is really dealt with quite at some length. And I think in the story of A Brief Marriage, the wedding scene or the marriage scene is, I mean, part of the problem is that the rituals cannot be performed. There's no priest, there's no family, there's no horoscope. I mean, these are all conservative and in many ways problematic rituals, but they mark in that book the breakdown of a society, the breakdown in a kind of central kind of social ritual. And I would say also in the story of A Brief Marriage, another ritual that, I mean, the funeral is something that is absent. You mentioned the scene in which Dinesh leaves behind his mother, and he covers her in one of her saris, and he weighs the corners of that sari down, and he leaves her bag next to her. But that's all he can do. And that's all that a lot of people could do in 2008, 2009, as they were fleeing government shelling, and as a relative or a loved one was killed, they, at the cost of losing their own life or the life of someone else close to them, they had to keep going. The body had to be left behind. And I think a great trauma for a lot of people was of leaving the body behind, of leaving it for flies and animals and for decomposition, for not being able to treat the body with the respect that it's due. And we all know that funerals are not for the living, are not for the dead, but they're for the ones who are left behind. And in a way, with my second book, the reason that I wanted to there's 3 chapters on there's 100 pages basically on Rani's funeral, and I wanted it was also an act of catharsis for me to give people who have not been able to perform rituals for their loved ones or for themselves, to give them a funeral, and to write a funeral with care, and to delineate every step of that process, every step of that ritual, and to also try to find some kind of meaning and significance in it. It was a kind of imaginary ritual that I performed in this book for people who had died in this time, and yeah, I think that's why it was so. I think that's why it was so important to me. I mean, there is also this, I mean, I think many of us have it, this fear that our language or that our culture will go extinct, at some point in the future, and because already half of us no longer live in the land that we're from, have been pushed thousands of miles away, that these things will be forgotten also. And for better or worse, whether these rituals are things we want to retain or modify or abandon completely, I wanted to kind of to have them there recorded in a way.
And what I can tell you is, as a reader, to be taken to a stranger's home, in this case, the stranger would be Rani, to be presented with the rituals, to wait with her and the family, to wait with Krishan as he's on the train and thinking about lovers and thinking about family. It did something. In fact, if I could just read from the page I have in front of me, it was in my notes, to quote me, forgive me, this is a narcissistic exercise, but he also write about and talk about the dead with care and perhaps rage. And it's just one of those things where I was curious about how you thought this through, and to hear you speak at length about the fact that you're right. The funeral pages are 100 pages. You've taken your time with everything. I'm not necessarily saying Rani is a stand-in for everything that's been lost, but catharsis, I think, is an apt word, a good word. Could I ask you a question about how the book is split up, and whether you had any say in that? Because it's broken down into 3 parts: message, journey, and burning. And depending on how you read, no pun intended, either word, you could think about a bunch of things. Did you have any say in that? Or how did you, I guess what I'm asking is, how did you construct this in your head? How did this come about as a book? And before you answer, forgive me, I'll give you another breather. For those watching, if you have questions, please feel free. Put them down in the comments. I'll do my best to have them addressed. And like I said, I need to give him a breather because he's been talking quite a bit. But back to you,
Anuk. Thanks for the breather. No, I did have a say. It was my choice to split it up in those ways, into those 3 parts. And I'm not sure why I did that, except to say that the book is very immersive, and there's very few. In general, there are very few breaks. If you look at a literary text, you have at a novel, you'll have chapter breaks. You'll have within the chapter, you'll have perhaps section breaks. Within sections, you'll have paragraph breaks. Within paragraphs, you'll have breaks that are marked by the full stop, breaks between sentences. And within each sentence, even if you don't have a full break or a sharp break, you have little pauses that you create with commas and with semicolons. And there are very few. I guess I've been told that the text has fewer paragraph breaks and fewer sentence breaks, fewer full stops than is customary. And I've done that because I wanted this sense of immersion in a kind of way of being part of the kind of one of the goals of this text was to think through the drama of ordinary life, to think through to inhabit trauma or to reflect on trauma, not as an event, not as something extraordinary or outside ordinary life, but to see it as part of the texture of everyday life. And so I didn't want there to be event in this book. I didn't want there to be, in a way, it's written totally the opposite. In a way, it's written very differently from the first book because there are no real events. There's a phone call, there's a journey to the Northeast, and then there's a funeral. And the main character doesn't act, he only observes, really, and he only responds. He's a character without much agency in this text. I guess I wanted him. I wanted the text to be. There were a few breaks for this reason. I wanted this kind of, it is difficult. I think it's demanding in a certain way, both as a writer and as a reader. I feel that the three parts of the novel, they're broken up just to get some space. I think just to make the text slightly more, and to be able to also move, because the thing is that if you have a text without, I mean, one of the functions of a paragraph break or a section break is to move quickly from different periods of time, right? And if you want the text to be continuous, you can't do that. But I also wanted this text to take place in in a couple of different situations. So I had to, I mean, the alternative would have been to write a 1,000-page book with like over the course of 3 days without those little breaks in time, and I couldn't do that, I think.
I have to say, when I was going over some of the reviews of your work, of Passage North, there was one comment that a critic made, I forget the name, where the person mentioned that the book is frustrating because of the long sentences. And I have to say on camera live, that is a bloody daft comment. Because the intent at the end of the day, for me as I'm reading this, is really clear, that you have to wait with the text. There's a reason why you have to wait with the text. And if you do, it makes you think. There's a question among our viewers. I'm sure this is a question that you've been asked before because I've read the response to it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. It's got to do with how being a student of philosophy has affected your work. There's such strong dwelling on everyday relationships and the self as the stories are being told. Like I said, I know you've addressed this, but I'm just asking it because I'm not sure whether the person asking it has read everything that you've ever responded to in writing.
So this is a question about the role of, I guess, philosophy in my work.
Right.
So I studied philosophy quite seriously. I never really read fiction when I was younger, and actually my first experience of reading as a boy was philosophy because I saw a film, Alexander by Oliver Stone, a terrible film in retrospect, but Anthony Hopkins played Aristotle, and he seemed so wise, and there was a bookshop near my house with Aristotle, so I just bought it one day and I read it, and that led me into, that really was the beginning of my reading life when I was 15 or 16, and I think I was talking earlier about how when I was younger, writing was a kind of searching or an attempt to understand what the world is like, but also how I should live or how I should organize my life. And philosophy in its classic form is about that question: how should one live? That's the question of ethics. So this was philosophy was my way of trying to answer those questions. At a certain point, I realized that how people study philosophy in universities, which is where in the West philosophy is said to happen, is very removed from life, from the moods that we live in, the circumstances and the context and the conditions that we live in. That it's very abstracted in certain ways. And so at that point I found literature as a way of both inhabiting life and also reflecting philosophically on it. And I think that's also part of why, like, some of my writing doesn't have or there isn't as much attention given to, I guess, more novelistic things. None of the characters in any of my books are well-rounded characters. They're all partial and one-sided, or given from a very particular point of view. There's also not much in the way of story, or if there is some narrative, it's really a kind of it's more creating a rich context in which one can ask about what it means to live or how one should approach life from these contexts. So I mean, obviously, I ended up doing a dissertation in philosophy, and I guess in various ways that has contributed, but it's difficult to say. It's really difficult to tangle or disentangle influences.
No, absolutely. And you also make dry observations about the academy, like Krishan most certainly does, with respect to what is read and what is taught. But there's a question here about, which I should have really asked you, so forgive me, about what you've read to get to a point where you could have written a passage north. And I think it'll be helpful for everyone listening in, whether you could offer any specific examples with respect to writers, the cinema. Anthony Hopkins is a good one.
I don't recommend.
No, but I'm curious, even as a writer, like who did you read to get this far to make this, and now who are you reading? And that is a question from Champaca as well, who are hosting us tonight.
I have to. So there are books that I can recommend that have been very important to me. I'll add that. I'm not like extremely well read by now. I have read a lot of books, but I'm a slow reader, and I tend to look for books that I can read again, that I want to read again, and I also tend to avoid contemporary literature. And it's not because I don't believe that there are good writers writing now or anything like that, but it's simply because history has its role in time. Time decides in many ways which books are remembered and which books are not. And of course, for political reasons, and a lot of books that deserve to be remembered are not. But I tend to. I mean, time has already played a selective role. And contemporary literature has not gone through this filtration process, and so I guess I'm I feel more confidence in reading a book that many people have loved over generations, or many people have got something out of over generations, that I will get something also from those texts. Specifically for this book, I would say Proust is very important. I've not read the whole thing. I've read 4 books, but I read these books carefully. I read. I'll take notes. I'll copy passages out into my notebook. I do that a lot with text. If I find a beautiful passage, I copy it by hand. There's a book by a Hungarian writer, A Book of Memories by Peter Nadash. It's an uneven book because there are certain parts that are kind of a slog to get through, but the parts that are worthwhile getting through are really and truly worthwhile. There was a Thomas Bernard novel, Extinction, that this book was structured on the basis of. That book also started off with a message and then a funeral. There's W.G. Sebald, who also writes without drama and who writes in this kind of quiet way. And I've read his works. I've read a few of his books multiple times. And I try, I would also say that there's a lot of Tamil literature I've read, but Tamil literature, my interests are much more varied. I could read anything. I could read erotic stories. I could read self-help books. I could read anything because I'm interested in the culture. But when it comes to books from abroad, English language books, I'm interested again in this question of how should I live and what's life like. So there are only specific. So my reading is a little bit more directed, and I guess another thing is that there's a sense in which we're told we should read this or we should read that, in which we are told to read books because they help us learn what other people's lives are like, and because as a kind of moral imperative. And I think that's true. I think it's true, but I feel that I can understand more of get a sense of other people's lives more easily through film, for example, or music or TV, and that's kind of not what I read. I reserve reading for I don't. I guess I try to follow. I try to follow. If I find a text that I love, I'll read all of it. I read everything else by the writer. Things like that. So I try not to let outside influences determine what I read, and I am quite stubborn about that. And I don't know if that'll help, but that's what
I'm sure it will, and that's also a good way to put it. If I love something, I'll read it, because at the end of the day, I think the hope for most of us is, irrespective of whatever shortlist and long list we're on, and I hope you get on many. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the hope is the book will still be read, that someone will return to it, read it, and it'll be there for them. There's an excellent question that a viewer has posed, which I'll ask. So we've spoken about time, hope, longing, and ritual. I'm wondering if you could also talk about your approach to the subject of love, particularly in A Passage North.
I guess I was interested in. I do know that I've heard from some readers that this section, that there is the journey part of the section was jarring or uninteresting or seemed to drag because it didn't seem also related to the kind of thrust of the rest of the novel. And I think what I was interested in describing kind of infatuation or like intense desire or love in this sense, in these senses of the word, was that this is also a kind of one way in which the metrics of time seem to change, in which it was for me another way to study or to be interested in time and the passing of time and the way in which certain experiences stay on. And I wanted to think about the way in which certain events exist like deposits in the mind that were also not totally sad, that were not born of violence or trauma. And also because it was another way of thinking through yearning or longing or desire, which this book is very much about. It's about wanting things that you can't articulate, whether that is a life with another person, whether that is people who have been taken away from you, whether that is a state or a country in which you can live with dignity. None of which are things that we can articulate beforehand, that we can say this is what we want this to look like. But I wanted to study the state of this condition, the condition of feeling that there's something outside of you that you want. And I mean that was kind of a big reason for me to be interested in this kind of situation. And Anjum, the character from Bangalore that the main character is infatuated with or has fallen in love with, she's also she's also kind of, for me, she was a way of studying, actually, in a way, a certain type of response to longing for another world. The person who through their work, through their activism, and through their political conviction is devoted to another world, so much so that they seem to care in some way less so about the world that they actually live in. And in that sense, Anjum is similar to the two black tigers, the two women, Puhal and Darshika, who come up at the end of the novel. And I think, those three characters for me are all connected in some way. But I don't know if that helps. But I think that's kind of why I spend so much time. And also because I wanted to dwell on something that was not something that was hopeful or nice, something that wasn't. I was really searching. I didn't want to write this book. I didn't want to write about this again. It was not my plan. It turned out that I could not stop thinking about this war and this genocide. but I tried my best to write about other things, and so that, I mean, it's this part of the novel exists out of that impulse.
And, as you said, I didn't want to write about this, but you also wrote about this, that, and everything else. There are sequences with Anjum, especially when she's smoking weed with Krishan. There are paragraphs in there I wish I had written, to be perfectly honest with you. But there's also praise in the comments with respect to how you have observed Delhi university life. And there's also a comment in here about the moments where, quote, Anuk writes about thinking and feeling. It was so poetic and beautiful. Thank you. Dude, no apologies for writing this. This is something that made me, as a reader, genuinely think. I'm just going through the chat box. Forgive me. I should do this better because I teach, but online interaction is sometimes tricky. Here's one. As a reader, Anuk, I felt that in the story of A Brief Marriage, as you've already said, actions were given more importance than the emotional temperament of the characters. But at the same time, the book was so emotionally draining. Was that intentional, or was that something that happened during the writing process?
See, I am probably as fortunate as somebody from my community could be, and I am not, and I have not been, except as a civilian dealing with police and army in Colombo, I've really not been affected by the war personally. And when I understood what had happened in the Northeast, I felt great guilt and great shame, and I don't think it's just me. I think it was any Tamil who lived outside this area, any young Tamil, any Tamil of my generation was unable to stop thinking about this, and this book was also written as a kind of punishment. I was trying to, in retrospect, I was punishing myself for being able to have lived a normal life while this was going on, and in many cases, long periods of that time, for not being aware and for going on. It's like, think about someone close to you has passed away, but you don't get the news for 2 days, and in that 2 days, you've gone with your friends on a holiday, or you've been petty, or you've been gossiping with your friends, and then you find out afterwards, and you think, and then this, while the person close to you has died, you were doing all of these other things. I think it's impossible in such a situation not to want to punish yourself, not to feel that you've done something wrong. And so I wrote this book as a punishment to myself, and by extension, also, the reader was punished. And I think if you feel the book is emotionally draining, that's because it was written as a punishment.
And how about a passage north? Is there forgiveness with respect to the writer who is chronicling and exhuming and excavating memories? Is there a difference in how we've written this?
I think so, because I think this second book actually... see, the first line of my first book, most children have 2 whole legs and 2 whole arms, but this little boy that Dinesh was carrying had just 1 arm. It starts with this: most people, this is how the world is ordinarily, and then and then there's this move in the middle of the sentence that says, but this boy, who you have not been paying attention to. In fact, you don't even know that people live like this. There's this mockery of the reader and the writer for being surprised that such things can go on. With this second book, it's actually written from the point of view, class-wise, worldview-wise, of somebody who's actually much closer to me, whose life is much more similar to mine. And I think, I mean, maybe in a way it was important for me to write that, to like also understand that, this experience of not being present at this time when your community is being destroyed, that experience actually belongs to half of our community. Like previous to this period of time, we defined a diasporic Tamil as someone who lived outside the island of Sri Lanka. But I think after this event, in a way, we can define diaspora as those who are not present, those who witness this from afar. And I think I came to realize that's a real and legitimate experience of people from our community too. Half of us watched and were unable to do anything.
Would you be open to one more question?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So this is a question.
I don't have anything to do, so.
Neither do I, but I think, I have no idea where people are, so we can just pretend that they want to listen.
Okay.
So here's a question about queerness,
Okay.
particularly with the two black tigers, Anjum, and the absence of it. That she seems aware of with Krishan and the metro scene. Sorry, I should have phrased that better, but forgive me. And I'm not, for those who are listening and who haven't read the book, we're not giving anything away. Honestly, the book behaves very differently. But I guess it's a question about how queerness operates in the book and the queer spaces in the book.
Yeah. It isn't. I wouldn't say it's a subject of. It's. I've also thought about it, and and I don't actually know how it operates. Actually, I'm not able to articulate why there are these moments in which this subject comes up, or why it was important for example, Anjum to watch this documentary, to see these two women who are part of the Black Tigers, to watch their intimacy and to wonder if, I mean, in a sense, I mean, if we are thinking of queerness as a form of intimacy that has not been, that is not sanctioned by the society in which the intimacy is taking place, then this is a queer relationship, and Anjum is aware of it, and she points it out. I don't really know. I think part of it also had to do with a desire to. It's always important to me when I write to write from a place of. I'll say this because I really don't know. There's further. I mean, there's a lot that I could ask. One could ask, and that I couldn't give an answer to. But I'll say that it's important for me when I'm writing to write from a place of what I'm calling epistemic humility. This or epistemic modesty. That there is uncertainty in knowing another, that we can interpret, and there are charitable and less charitable interpretations, but that. Always how we understand another is provisional. Any interpretation is always, and it's always important to me. And I think maybe you'll notice in my writing, there's a lot of maybes and there's a lot of perhaps. Perhaps this is why this happens, or perhaps this is why this happens. Perhaps maybe this is why this person is doing this, or maybe this is why. So my writing actually there's always this. I'm always proposing multiple complementary or perhaps contradictory, incompatible interpretations of situations, and the kind of the reading that these two people have this intimacy, and it could have another source than just Tamil nationalism or just ideological. The sharing of an ideology was important. I didn't want. I wanted always to I don't want to reduce, I guess, these characters to a single. And that's also why a lot of the characters are presented in a very partial way. There's no like attempt to get to the bottom of any of these characters.
Yeah, and I'll even say that with the characters you write, there's very little certainty as to who they are. I mean, there are moments where you think you know, but then you don't, to a certain degree. The certainty that I see as a reader, anyway, are the factual certainties. War, what war does to people, the numbers. But that's a topic for another day. I'll ask you one more. And this has to do, it's a craft question that a viewer has already put in the chat box, and I'll embellish it. It's got to do with what you said earlier, when you said, I didn't expect to write this underlined fluorescent lights, hashtag this, right? So when you started, did you know as a writer how it might end? And the viewer's question is related to the final sentence from A Passage North. Did you know the ending as you discovered and you realized, I'm writing this? You're shaking your head.
No, I didn't. No, I mean, I knew this text was, there was, I mean, it is a very limited text in terms of narrative and what happens. It's very tight. It's not a tight text, but it's what happens is tightly constricted. There's news, there's a journey, and then there's this funeral. So I knew it would end at the funeral, and I didn't know that it would end with the last line. But the last line ends with this analogy between the smoke billowing out of the funeral pyre and this kind of gentle allusion to a scene earlier in which the character is thinking about the cloud messenger, and thinking about how the cloud and the cloud messenger, which doesn't happen in the poem, but how he always imagines it happening, the cloud dissipating and actually not communicating the message that the cloud is intended to communicate. And there was just a moment when I was writing, and I was describing, towards the end, I was describing the clouds of smoke, and I thought, and how they would dissipate, and then I thought of the cloud messenger. And in fact, that ending was what made me write in that retelling of the cloud messenger, to write in that bit about how the cloud dissipates. Yeah.
You're working on essays too at the moment, rumor has it. So I'm curious as to what nonfiction could do for you. Or in other words, are you going to be exploring subjects that are different than in the books that use fiction? I'm not asking for trade secrets, but I'm curious about why you're turning to essays. Or in fact, you don't even have to respond to that. It's just
it isn't. But I'm actually not. There was a brief moment in which I may have made a proposal or two about writing nonfiction. But with nonfiction, you expose yourself. In nonfiction, the eye of the text is the eye of the author. In fiction, when you read fiction, you are told, or after a while, that you're not supposed to identify the author with the narrator of the text. There's this distance in fiction that allows for more freedom and less exposure. And when you're writing in English to an audience that you do not know, because all sorts of people read, and would find books accidentally, and I don't know who these people are, and I don't want to expose myself to them, really. I like my privacy. So I mean, I would write nonfiction in Tamil, actually, because in Tamil I know my audience, or I know the people who read, the kinds of people who read, and the community that I'm writing to much better. With English, because English doesn't have a locale anymore, and because it's a language without a land anymore, literally any Tom, Dick, and Harry from any country can read your book, and I'm not going to show myself to such a person.
Is there anything that you wish we had asked you that you want to respond to?
No, you've asked such lovely questions. Thank you, Deepak, for reading the book and for all of these really lovely questions. I really appreciate it, and thank you everybody also for the questions.
I have to say to everyone who's watching, it's a book that you need to read once, then you need to read again. But then the story of a brief marriage is very similar. It is my privilege to be in conversation, and that's the formal way of saying it. Your writing kicks ass would be the informal way of saying it. So I've said it. Thank you all for tuning in, for taking the time to listen to us. Thank you for the comments, which he will read at the end, I promise you, especially the praise, which he will savor. I promise you that too. And thank you, Champaca, for the opportunity for us to converse and think. This is the first conversation I've had with Anuk, even though this should have happened ages ago.
I almost feel reluctant to come back here. That was a very moving conversation. Thank you. Anuk, it's almost as beautiful to listen to you as to read you. So I'm quite emotional actually, because there's a certain intensity of thought and thinking that has gone beforehand. And I know Deepak also to be that sort of writer. It's very special, and we're very, very grateful as Champaca, because this is what we really, really want to do, to talk to people like you. So thank you. I hope everyone can get hold of a copy of the book. It's available in store. Please read Deepak's book, The Temporary People, Anuk's books, all of them, and tell your friends about them. And we're online, so please visit our store. I'm just going to leave it here and thank everyone who's been here to ask questions, and the two of them. So good night, good morning, good afternoon, as Deepak said, and hope to see you for another event at some point. So take care, everyone.